Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a product leader specializing in B2B software, and today I'm talking about localization, providing users and website visitors with the information that's relevant to them, no matter where they are in the world. Localization is one of those things that product managers and marketers really tend to want, and with good reason. It's really critical for any product that will be serving multiple geographies. It's also a nice soft step in the direction of personalization. This is especially relevant for websites, e-commerce platforms, and any product with global reach. Localization can take a few forms. On the simple end, you can provide a separate screen for each place you want to serve. When it comes to websites, some companies take this further and build out an entire separate site for each country or geographical region. I see this primarily in global companies that want to provide global reach while still maintaining a nice local feel. On the more complex end, you can pull in varying content based on the user's geography. A lot of content management platforms will allow you to have components or areas that pull in data depending on where the user is coming from. And for really advanced localization, you may need a database connected solution. Localization drives up costs pretty steeply, pretty quickly if you're not careful. So it's important to go through some key considerations up front. Understand what's vital, what's not, make sure you have the right resources lined up and ready to do the work you need. So here are some things to consider. First up, what does local mean? And that sounds like a really silly ask. In fact, I've had people get annoyed with me for asking it because to them it's so obvious. But it's a valid and important thing to lock down. Does local mean the country level, the region, the state, the town? Is it a mile or kilometer radius from a particular place? A lot of companies have local franchises or sales offices with sales territories that are contractually defined. So if a person from sales territory A comes to a website or a store locator and they get information from the store serving area B, you could have some pretty annoyed franchisees or managers, or maybe even a lawsuit. So that's really important to consider right up front. Next up, what content or functionality needs to be localized? It probably doesn't need to be everything across the whole product. And it's easy to say, we need to localize this, but it does take some thought and planning to figure out which key things you're actually going to change. Items like language, local office information, address formats, things like that are pretty much a no-brainer. You might have local promotions or events to talk about. Depending on your industry, it might make sense to pull in location-based weather information and things like that. There are services that provide this data that you can pull in. Any time-based data needs to account for time zones. You'll need to convert to metric for most countries. Then there are cultural considerations. And this is where a lot of US-based folks do tend to drop the ball a little bit, simply because it's not top of mind for us. And if you're not accounting for those things, you may find pictures of lush rainforests and waterfalls on something that's intended for a country that's mostly desert. One time I had a problem because an agency put a photo of a bridge on every European version of a screen. And it turned out that bridge was in Ireland, and our colleagues in the UK were not too happy about that. It wasn't a huge deal, but it did cause a little consternation. And so those are the kinds of things you can avoid if you're paying more attention to what's going on in the individual places and just putting in that work and consideration upfront. And there's no shame in asking. Your organization may have folks all around the world who would be happy to review designs and read content and let you know if you've gotten anything maybe not quite right. This all sounds like homework, and it is. But it's the difference between a product that claims to be localized and one that truly feels like it belongs in every geography. The third consideration is to design the right spaces. So say you've had all your copy translated into multiple languages and it doesn't fit on the screen. That's a really common problem, and it is so frustrating when it happens. It turns out English is a pretty pithy language. We can say a lot with just a few words and a few characters. And because we're usually writing things in English first and then translating from there, the things that we write are optimized for English right out of the gate. And what that means is Whatever copy you've written is almost guaranteed to take up more space in every other language. And sometimes it's a lot more. So get ahead of this problem by passing your designer some copy translated into a bunch of your target languages. And I mean real copy, not lorem ipsum, so that they can check out this space and really pay special attention to the ones that are taking up more space on the screen. You also want to consider non-Western character sets and languages that read right to left. These are all things with technical solutions that you can absolutely accommodate, but it does tend to take a little bit of extra thinking up front to make sure that your design also accommodates them. And now we get into the part where I see a lot of struggle because it starts adding extra work. And that is, where is all of the local content coming from? Obviously, all the planning and design in the world won't put actual content on the screen. Someone has to create or source that content. And that's true of any content, but when you're providing localized content, you've multiplied the work. And in my experience, the biggest challenge to localization is often just getting the content. There are software solutions that can automate the publishing and translation of a lot of content. Those services do tend to get costly, and you still need a human to curate them. So they're not necessarily within reach for a lot of organizations. You can also design your screens and your content in a way that minimizes what kind of local content you actually need. And of course, the best local content comes from, and you'll never guess this, local people. They are an invaluable resource in not just getting the content in the first place, but also reviewing to make sure you've gotten everything correct. So before you commit to any localization solution, make sure you know where your content is coming from and that you talk to the people you're expecting to get it from and not just assuming. And finally, where will the local content keep coming from? And this is really similar to the last point, but I have seen in the past where someone in a local sales office provides content up front, but then they're not available to keep maintaining it and it gets out of date really quickly. A lot of times, local sales offices are your only presence in certain countries or places, and those offices are staffed with a skeleton crew and their sales folks and admin team. They're not technologists, they're not content generators, they're just there to sell product. And so their time tends to get spread very thin, or there's turnover and the new person doesn't want to do it or doesn't feel like they have time, and you end up with a mess in pretty short order. So ask yourself, do you have commitment from someone in each geography to provide content in the long term and keep it updated? And do you have buy-in from the local leadership team that this person will be given the time to do that work? And if the person leaves, then the leadership team will find someone else to do that work. A lot of times you'll get that buy-in from most places except a few. And in those cases, you can usually fill in the gaps with something a little more generic that just gets translated into a few key languages. And this approach allows for true localization wherever it's feasible and still provides something that feels pretty local for everyone else. And if you're still left with a lot of holes, it might be time to rethink your localization strategy altogether. So with these actions, defining geographies, deciding what spaces need local content, designing and planning for that content, getting the right content, and ensuring regular updates, you'll avoid some of the most common snags and frustrations in localization. And if this sounds like something that you could use help with, come find me on LinkedIn. I'll post a link to that and my website below.